So here's something that might surprise you. While most of us are still grabbing whatever looks good at the grocery store in August, there are entire communities across America, particularly Amish families in places like Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and Holmes County, Ohio, who are already deep into a yearly ritual that their grandparents and great-grandparents followed before them. They're loading up their pantries, and I mean seriously loading them up, with staples that will carry them all the way through winter and beyond. I had the chance a while back to step inside a stone-walled pantry on a property just outside Millersburg, Ohio. And honestly, I stopped counting jars somewhere around 400. The homeowner, a woman who clearly ran a very tight kitchen, didn't even blink at the number. She told me they'd work through the whole supply by March. In her mind, that was just normal. That was just how food worked. And you know what? The more I looked into it, the more I realized she was onto something most of us have totally forgotten. So today I want to walk you through 15 staples that Amish families routinely put away before summer wraps up, explain why each one gets purchased when it does, and share what we actually know about how long these foods last in storage. There are some genuinely fascinating preservation methods on this list, especially toward the end, that predate modern refrigeration by well over 100 years and are still being used on working farms right now. Let's jump in. One, sugar bought by the 50-pound sack. Here's the thing about sugar in an Amish household. It's not really about sweetening your morning cup of coffee. It's about what's right around the corner on the calendar. Starting in late July and running through all of August, fruit starts coming in hot. Peaches arrive first, then pears follow close behind, then apples start dropping, and finally, the grapes hit. Every single one of those fruits needs sugar to become jam, jelly, preserves, or canned fruit. So Amish families get ahead of that wave. They'll purchase sugar in massive 50-pound sacks, sometimes multiple sacks, well before the fruit season peaks. This way, they're not competing with every other home canner in the county once the peaches actually ripen and everybody suddenly needs sugar at the same time. And the beautiful part is there's basically zero risk in buying early. Refined white sugar is one of the most shelf-stable foods on the planet. Because its moisture content is so incredibly low, bacteria and mold simply cannot grow in it. When you seal sugar properly and keep it dry, it can sit there for years, even decades, without any loss in quality whatsoever. Most Amish households transfer those big sacks into food-grade buckets fitted with tight gasket lids. Tuck them into a dry basement corner and forget about them until it's time to start canning. A single household doing a full season of preserving can easily burn through well over 100 pounds of sugar between midsummer and the end of October. That sounds like a lot until you realize that a single batch of strawberry jam can call for several cups of sugar all by itself. Multiply that across peach butter, grape jelly, apple preserves, and pear sauce, and you start to understand why that 50-pound sack doesn't last as long as you'd think. 2, canning and pickling salt. The right kind matters. This is a detail that catches a lot of beginners off guard. You cannot just grab a canister of regular iodized table salt from the grocery store and use it for preserving. Ordinary table salt contains anti-caking agents and iodine additives that will cloud your brine and turn your pickles an unappetizing dark color. Nobody wants cloudy pickle juice or off-colored cucumbers. What you actually need is pure canning salt, sometimes labeled pickling salt, which is just plain sodium chloride with absolutely nothing else added. Amish families tend to purchase this stuff by the case, often in bulk quantities of 25 pounds or more, well before the height of pickling season. And there's a practical reason for the early purchase. Hardware stores and farm supply shops in canning country frequently sell completely out of pickling salt by the time September rolls around. That salt goes into cucumber pickles, homemade sauerkraut, meat-curing blends, and the sausage recipes that come out once the first hard frost hits. And just like sugar, properly stored dry salt essentially never goes bad. A case you pick up in July will be just as effective the following spring. Some families in Ohio and Pennsylvania actually prefer mined mineral salts. There's a brand from Utah called Redmond Real Salt that comes in 25-pound bags because it's completely free of the dextrose and anti-caking chemicals that can interfere with the bacterial cultures responsible for fermentation if you're planning to make proper brine pickles or sauerkraut. Those bacterial cultures need a clean environment to do their work, and additives in the salt can genuinely mess that process up. Bulk stores and heavy canning areas report moving well over 1,000 pounds of salt to local households by mid-August in a typical year. That's enough to cover an entire season of pork curing, kraut production, cheese making, and butter preservation. 3. Vinegar, by the gallon. And timing is everything. Vinegar serves as the acid backbone for almost every pickling recipe. And pickling is essentially the technology that turns an overwhelming summer garden into a winter's worth of side dishes. Amish families often purchase vinegar by the gallon jug during midsummer, both for canning purposes and for the dozens of other household jobs vinegar handles around the home, cutting through grease, rinsing hair, softening laundry water, and cleaning cast iron pans. Factory bottled, sealed vinegar is shelf-stable for pretty much as long as you care to keep it. The acidity is its own preservative. Purchasing a good supply before the cucumber harvest peaks means you're not scrambling to find it on the shelf when every other canner in the region has the same idea. But here's the part that a lot of people don't know about. Small local cider presses that produce raw, unpasteurized apple cider vinegar are completely tied to the apple harvest. They press while there are apples to press, and the moment the apples are gone, they shut down. In most of the Midwest, that's roughly a 90-day window, starting around mid-July, and closing whenever the first hard frost shows up, usually somewhere in the first 3 weeks of October in places like northeastern Ohio. Once that window closes, the only vinegar you'll find is the pasteurized, filtered kind from the grocery store. It'll still preserve a cucumber just fine, but it doesn't carry the live cultures that raw vinegar does, and it behaves quite differently in fermentation-based recipes that depend on that microbial activity. Hey, real quick, if you're finding this helpful so far, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the list. Drop a comment below and let me know which of these you've tried or want to try. All right, let's keep going. 4. Dried beans. Fresh crop makes all the difference. Pinto, navy, black, kidney, and great northern beans, purchased in 25-pound sacks, are a foundational staple in Amish pantries. And here's something that might change how you think about dried beans. Timing genuinely matters more than most people realize. Beans harvested from the most recent growing season cook significantly faster and taste noticeably better than beans that have been sitting around in a warehouse for a year or two. Older beans lose moisture gradually, and as they dry out further, they become stubborn. They take much longer to soften during cooking, and some of them never fully lose that chalky toughness, no matter how long you simmer them. Purchasing that year's fresh crop while it's available, then transferring the beans into sealed food-grade containers with oxygen absorbers dropped in, keeps the quality high and gives a household one of the cheapest, longest-lasting protein sources you can possibly find. A single 25-pound bag cooked down stretches across dozens of meals for a tiny fraction of what the equivalent protein would cost at the meat counter. A single pound of dried pintos yields several cups of cooked beans, more than enough for a hearty dinner for a family of 4, and requires no refrigeration, no electricity, and stays usable for years in dry storage. 5. Old-fashioned rolled oats. Skip the brand name plain. Rolled oats purchased in bulk from a mill or a farm supply store, instead of in those small branded canisters at the supermarket, are dramatically cheaper per pound. We're talking often a third of the retail price, or even less once you factor in all the packaging and marketing markup built into that name brand box. Amish families buy the big sack, scoop portions into glass jars, and eat oatmeal throughout the winter months for just pennies per bowl. It's one of those choices that seems small in isolation, but compounds into meaningful savings over the course of a year. Stored in a sealed glass jar with a tight lid, rolled oats stay fresh and usable for a solid year or more without any special treatment. They don't need to be refrigerated. They don't need oxygen absorbers. They just need to stay dry. And beyond breakfast porridge, bulk oats pull their weight in all kinds of recipes: granola bars, oatmeal cookies, meatloaf filler, and even as a thickener for soups and stews. It's one of the most versatile grains you can keep on hand. And the broader principle at work here, whether or not an Amish household would describe it in these terms, is something food economists have been pointing out for years. A significant percentage of what consumers pay for processed grain products at the grocery store goes to packaging design, brand marketing, and the profit margins of a small number of large food companies, not to the grain itself. Purchasing closer to the source, whether that's a local mill or a bulk food supplier. Cuts that entire markup out of the equation. 6. Local honey. Late summer harvest is the one you want. Beekeepers in most parts of the country pull honey twice each year. The first harvest comes in late June, and the second arrives in late summer as the goldenrod and clover finish their bloom cycle. That late summer batch tends to have a richer, deeper flavor profile and somewhat higher mineral content than the earlier harvest, and it's the one that many Amish families prefer to buy by the gallon directly from a local beekeeper. That gallon of honey covers winter baking, sweetening tea, and the various home remedies that have been part of these communities for generations. And honey is famously one of the most durable stored foods known to humankind. Archaeologists have recovered sealed jars of honey from ancient Egyptian burial sites that were still perfectly edible after thousands of years. Honey's extremely low moisture content, combined with its natural acidity, creates an environment that microorganisms simply cannot survive in. A gallon purchased in August will be every bit as good the following spring, or the spring after that. With well over 100,000 registered beekeepers across the United States, plus countless more keeping hives informally, a local source is usually not terribly hard to track down within reasonable driving distance. Raw honey from a local beekeeper rather than a heavily filtered and blended supermarket product typically costs a bit more per gallon, but retains far more of the local pollen and natural enzyme content that commercial processing strips away. And since a full gallon weighs roughly 12 pounds and essentially never goes bad in a sealed container, even a modest supply on the shelf covers a household through any single pour honey season without worry. 7. Coffee, a globally exposed commodity. Coffee might seem like an odd inclusion on a pantry stocking list, but it's actually one of the more price-volatile items here. A drought in Brazil, a labor disruption in Colombia, or a shipping bottleneck anywhere along the global supply chain can push retail coffee prices up noticeably within a single season. Amish families who drink coffee, and plenty of them do, tend to purchase whole beans in bulk, divide them into smaller portions using vacuum-sealed bags, and store them in a cool, dark location. This approach extends the useful shelf life well beyond what a pre-ground bag sitting on a grocery shelf can manage. Ground coffee begins losing its aroma and flavor within just a few weeks of being ground, while sealed whole beans maintain their quality for well over a year. Buying when prices are stable and storing smartly is just good economic sense for a product whose price can swing unpredictably. There's also a social dimension to coffee in many Amish communities that outsiders don't always appreciate. Coffee is the drink that gets poured at every gathering, every barn raising, every after-church meal. Running out isn't just a personal inconvenience, it's a hospitality failure. Keeping a generous reserve on hand means being ready to welcome visitors at any time, which in these communities happens constantly and often without advance notice. Having a deep coffee supply is as much about community readiness as it is about personal preference. Quick reminder, if you're still with me and enjoying this, that like button really does help more people find this video. And subscribing means you'll catch the next one when it drops. Now let's get into some of the less obvious items on the list. 8. Baking soda. The Pantry workhorse baking soda is one of those products that earns its shelf space several times over because it does so many different jobs. Obviously, it's a leavening agent for baked goods, but beyond that, it functions as a household cleaner, a deodorizer, a gentle scrubbing abrasive for cookware, and even an emergency measure for smothering a small grease fire on the stovetop. And here's the key detail. Baking soda is practically indestructible in storage. Kept in a sealed container, it holds on to the vast majority of its usefulness for years, even if its leavening power diminishes ever so slightly over extended periods. It's one of those items where buying a large container and knowing it'll still be good 2 or 3 years from now just makes sense. 9. Baking powder, the one that actually goes stale. This is worth separating from baking soda because people often treat them as interchangeable in terms of storage, and they absolutely are not. Baking powder contains an acid component that reacts with moisture over time, meaning it loses genuine leavening strength after about a year on the shelf. You can test it by dropping a spoonful into hot water. If it doesn't fizz vigorously, it's past its prime. So unlike sugar or salt, baking powder isn't something you want to stockpile in massive quantities far in advance. The smarter approach is to buy it closer to when you'll actually use it and rotate through your supply. A simple version of this whole baking supply system doesn't require a farmhouse pantry, by the way. 4 half-gallon jars sitting on any kitchen shelf, labeled sugar, salt, baking soda, and baking powder, cover a surprising amount of a household's baking and preserving needs, all on their own. 10 fresh milled flour. Timing matches the wheat harvest across the American Midwest peaks in July, and flour ground from that freshly harvested crop reaches bulk food stores by mid-August at its peak quality. This is when Amish families tend to buy their flour for the year, and the timing isn't random. It's directly connected to when the grain is at its best. Flour gradually loses baking strength as it ages, and it can develop stale, off flavors through oxidation after sitting around for much more than a year. Purchasing it fresh from the current harvest and storing it in sealed, airtight containers keeps it performing well deep into the following year. Some families tuck a bay leaf into the container as a natural deterrent for pantry pests. Moths and weevils apparently don't care for the scent. A 50-pound sack of flour goes a remarkably long way. When you bake your own bread from bulk flour, the per loaf cost is a small fraction of what you'd pay for the same number of loaves at a bakery or even a grocery store bread aisle. It's one of those areas where doing a little more work in the kitchen translates directly into real savings. And here's something worth thinking about if you want to take this a step further. Freshly milled flour starts losing nutritional value within days of being ground. Commercial white flour has already had the nutrient-dense bran and germ removed entirely, with a few synthetic vitamins sprayed back in to meet government fortification requirements. Whole wheat berries, the intact grain kernels, sidestep this problem completely. Left unmilled, the grain's natural oils and nutrients stay locked in and dormant for years in dry, sealed storage. Some Amish households purchase several sacks of whole wheat berries instead of pre-milled flour and grind small batches, as needed using a hand-cranked countertop mill. These mills are built to last generations. It's not at all unusual to find a family still using the same mill that a grandparent purchased decades earlier. A good hand mill turns out about a cup of fresh flour in under 2 minutes of steady cranking, requires no electricity, and produces flour that smells and tastes noticeably different from anything you can buy in a bag. All right, friends, we're getting into the really interesting part of the list now. If you haven't already, tap that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss future videos like this one. And leave a comment. I genuinely love reading what you all think about this stuff. Let's keep rolling. 11 powdered dry milk, the backup that lasts for years for a household that doesn't keep a dairy cow, and most of us don't. Non-fat dry milk is an incredibly practical backup for baking, making gravy, mixing up pancake batter, and filling in during those stretches when fresh milk runs low. Amish families tend to stock up before autumn partly to dodge the price fluctuations that can follow fall dairy contract negotiations, and the shelf life on this stuff is genuinely remarkable. The United States Department of Agriculture has stated that non-fat dry milk stored properly in dry conditions below about 75 degrees Fahrenheit can be kept essentially indefinitely. Unopened containers are frequently still perfectly good 2, 5, or even 10 years past the date printed on the package. There was actually a long-running food science study conducted at Brigham Young University that evaluated non-fat dry milk samples stored for up to 29 years. The findings showed that the milk still retained usable quality and nutritional value as long as the packaging and storage conditions had been maintained. That's nearly 3 decades of shelf life from a product that cost just a few dollars. One critical distinction to be aware of, it is specifically the non-fat version of dry milk that stores this well. Whole milk powder contains fat, and that fat will eventually go rancid in storage. If you're stocking up for long-term use, non-fat is the only way to go. 12 home-rendered lard. Cheaper and better than you'd think. This one surprises a lot of people. But rendering your own lard is far more approachable than it sounds, and you absolutely do not need to own any pigs to do it. A proper butcher shop, not a supermarket meat counter, but a real, local butcher, will usually set aside leaf fat for you if you ask. Leaf fat is the fat that surrounds a hog's kidneys, and it renders into the cleanest, most neutral-tasting lard you can get. Most butchers sell it cheaply because the vast majority of their customers never think to request it. The process itself is straightforward. You chop the fat into small cubes, load them into a slow cooker, and let the whole thing render down on low heat over the course of several hours. Once the fat is liquefied and the cracklings have turned golden, you strain the liquid through cheesecloth into clean jars. What you end up with is a beautiful, white, shelf-stable cooking fat that will keep in a cool pantry for roughly a year. Compared to the vegetable oil-based shortening you find at the grocery store, typically soybean or palm oil that's been hydrogenated into a solid form, home-rendered lard costs a fraction of the price for the same volume. And it performs differently in baking, too. Pie crusts made with real lard come out noticeably flakier. Biscuits are lighter and more tender. There's a reason generations of bakers preferred it before the big food companies convinced everyone to switch to vegetable shortening in the mid-20th century. 13 canning jars. Buy before the rush. Here's a practical tip that can save you a lot of frustration. Buy your canning jars in spring, not summer. Ball & Kerr. The two companies that manufacture the overwhelming majority of home canning jars sold in the United States face a massive demand spike every single summer as gardens and orchards come into production. Popular sizes, especially wide mouth quarts, regularly sell out at rural hardware stores, farm supply shops, and bulk retailers by mid-August. This is a well-documented, year-after-year pattern. The glass jars themselves are essentially permanent. They last forever as long as you don't break them, and the screw-on rings can be reused for many years. The only piece that actually needs replacing each canning season is the flat metal lid that creates the vacuum seal, and those are inexpensive to restock. A household that invests in a few hundred jars once during the spring, before the seasonal crunch hits, and then simply keeps them clean and stacked through winter, ends up with a permanent supply that's ready whenever the tomatoes start coming in all at once. It can look like an excessive number of jars to someone who's never done serious home canning, right up until the moment the garden starts producing faster than you can eat, and you suddenly need 50 jars in a single weekend. 14 spices in bulk. Whole spices outlast ground by miles. This is one I wanted to add because it's so often overlooked in conversations about stocking a pantry, but it makes a tremendous difference both in terms of cost and flavor. Whole spices, peppercorns, cinnamon sticks, whole cloves, cumin seeds, mustard seeds, allspice berries, maintain their potency for dramatically longer than their pre-ground versions. Ground cinnamon from a grocery store spice rack might hold good flavor for about 6 months before it starts fading into something bland and dusty. A cinnamon stick, stored in a sealed jar, that'll still pack a punch 2 or 3 years later. The same principle holds true across almost every spice category. The essential oils that give spices their flavor and aroma are protected inside the intact seed or bark, and they dissipate rapidly once that structure is broken through grinding. Amish families and other households that cook from scratch at any serious scale tend to buy whole spices in bulk and grind them as needed, often using a simple mortar and pestle or a small dedicated grinder. The per-ounce cost of buying whole spices from a bulk supplier versus buying tiny pre-ground jars from the grocery store spice aisle is night and day, often 5 to 10 times cheaper. And the flavor difference is immediately noticeable the first time you crack open a fresh peppercorn versus shaking out some pre-ground pepper that's been sitting on a shelf for who knows how long. We're coming down the home stretch now, and the last item on this list is honestly my favorite. It's a preservation technique that's over 100 years old and barely anyone talks about it anymore. Before we get there, do me a quick favor and smash that like button if you've learned even one new thing today. Subscribe if you haven't already, and seriously, drop me a comment. I read every single one. Okay, here we go. 15 water-glassed eggs. The old technique most people have never heard of. This is the one I want you to pay the most attention to, because it's genuinely fascinating and incredibly practical. Chickens lay at their absolute peak production between roughly June and August, which means late summer is when eggs are the most plentiful and the cheapest. It's also the exact point in the year when a preservation technique called water glassing, sometimes called liming, allows a household to bank that abundance and stretch it out for months without any refrigeration whatsoever. This method has real history behind it. Agricultural extension circulars describing the technique go back to at least the early 1900s. A publication from the Utah Agricultural College in 1917 noted that egg preservation had already passed the experimental stage even at that time. During the food rationing years of the Second World War, extension services all across the country, including in Pennsylvania, actively encouraged farm families to preserve their surplus eggs at home rather than let them go to waste. This was a period when store-bought eggs, along with sugar and coffee, were all restricted by government ration coupons. The original method used sodium silicate dissolved in water, literally a product called water glass, which is where the technique gets its name. Today, most people use food-grade pickling lime, which is calcium hydroxide, instead. It's much easier to find at any canning supply store, and it doesn't cause the egg white whipping problems that sodium silicate was known for. The actual process is beautifully simple. You dissolve approximately 1 ounce of pickling lime per quart of cool water, stir until it's thoroughly mixed, and pour the solution into a clean crock or food-grade bucket. Then you gently place clean, unwashed, uncracked eggs into the solution, making sure every egg is fully submerged. If any float, weight them down with a plate or a clean stone. Seal the container and store it somewhere cool and dark. A basement corner works perfectly. Here's what's happening on a chemical level. The alkaline lime solution reacts with the eggshell and effectively seals the shell's natural pores, creating a barrier that bacteria cannot penetrate. Meanwhile, the egg inside remains essentially unchanged. The white and yolk stay fresh, as if they'd just been collected. Properly water-glassed eggs are commonly reported to remain perfectly edible for 8 to 12 months, and sometimes considerably longer, all without refrigeration. When you're ready to use one, you simply pull it from the solution. Rinse off the lime residue, crack it open, and cook it normally. The equipment required is almost laughably minimal. A bucket, a container of food-grade pickling lime, which is inexpensive, and a single container goes a remarkably long way. And a steady supply of fresh, unwashed eggs. That last detail is important. The eggs need to be unwashed, because the natural protective coating on the outside of a freshly laid egg, called the bloom, helps the lime solution work properly. Store-bought eggs have typically had that bloom washed off during commercial processing, which is why eggs sourced from a local backyard flock or a farmer's market are strongly preferred for this method. One thing worth mentioning, water-glassed eggs do have a slightly different texture than a freshly collected egg when you scramble or fry them. The whites can be a touch thinner, but for baking, they perform identically. And in the dead of winter, when fresh local eggs might be unavailable or significantly more expensive due to reduced hen production during the short daylight months, having a bucket of perfectly preserved summer eggs sitting in the basement is an enormous practical advantage. It's a remarkable amount of preservation capability from almost no equipment and very little cost, which is precisely why the technique quietly persisted in farming communities for over a century, even as it vanished from mainstream kitchens after electric refrigeration became standard in the mid-20th century. Bonus, apple cider vinegar as a health tonic and fermentation starter. I wanted to sneak one more in here because it connects so naturally to the vinegar discussion earlier. Beyond its role in pickling, raw unpasteurized apple cider vinegar plays a separate role in many Amish households as a daily health tonic and as a starter culture for various fermentation projects. A tablespoon diluted in a glass of water before meals is a folk remedy that's been passed down for generations. And while the scientific evidence on its health benefits is still evolving, there's enough research on its effects on blood sugar regulation and digestive function to make it more than just an old wives' tale. As a fermentation starter, a splash of raw apple cider vinegar with its visible mother, that cloudy strand of beneficial bacteria and yeast floating in the bottle, can kickstart a new batch of homemade vinegar from apple scraps or juice, essentially allowing a household to produce their own vinegar indefinitely from a single initial purchase. It's one of those self-perpetuating systems that appeals to anyone interested in reducing dependence on store-bought products. The bigger picture, it's a system, not a checklist. None of these 15 items really work in isolation. What makes an Amish pantry function so effectively is that all of these staples interconnect and reinforce each other across the entire year. The salt cures the meat. The vinegar creates the pickling brine that accompanies it. The sugar and the fruit season overlap deliberately. The flour and the lard end up in the same pie crust. The honey sweetens the tea that warms you up after a cold day of outdoor work. The eggs preserved in summer become the breakfast protein on a February morning. It's less of a shopping list and more of an interlocking set of habits that, once established, tend to sustain themselves year after year with minimal effort. The purchases happen when each item is freshest, cheapest, and most available. The storage methods are simple and proven, and the whole system runs without any electricity, any subscription service, or any complicated technology. And there's a psychological benefit to this approach that's easy to underestimate until you've experienced it. Knowing that your pantry is stocked, truly stocked, with months of staples put away, brings a kind of quiet confidence that's hard to describe. You stop worrying about whether the store will be out of something. You stop feeling the pinch every time prices jump on a particular commodity. You stop making those frantic last-minute grocery trips. There's a steadiness to it, a sense of being prepared rather than reactive, that changes how you relate to food and to the seasons themselves.